It was a normal day in the busy city, filled with the sounds of honking cars, people rushing to work, and the usual buzz of city life. Among all the noise, a man in his late 30s walked calmly along the sidewalk. He wore a plain jacket and faded jeans, looking like any other person in the crowd. His face showed little emotion, but his eyes were sharp and observant. He wasn't just any ordinary person, though. He was an undercover FBI agent, part of a team working on a high-stakes operation to infiltrate a criminal network. The agent's name was Alex, and he had been in this line of work for more than a decade. He was used to being unnoticed, blending into his surroundings, staying hidden in plain sight. Today, he was in the heart of the city, observing a meeting that could change everything. He had been tracking the criminal group for months, gathering information piece by piece. Everything depended on this moment. He knew that this could be the breakthrough they needed, but he also understood the risks. Undercover work was never easy, and the stakes were always high. As he walked down the street, Alex kept his distance from the small group of men gathered in the alley ahead. They were discussing something, passing briefcases between them, their conversation low and guarded. Alex's job was to keep an eye on them and report back to his team. He wasn't supposed to get involved in anything that could blow his cover. His training had taught him that patience and caution were his best friends. Today, he was just a man on the street, walking in a crowd, unseen. But as Alex continued to move closer to the alley, he suddenly felt the shift. It was the subtle shift that every experienced agent could feel, the feeling that someone was watching him. His instincts kicked in, and he slowed his pace. His gaze moved across the street, catching sight of a figure walking in his direction. The man, wearing a blue police uniform, had been watching him closely for the past few moments. Alex wasn't sure if the officer had noticed him in particular or if it was just a coincidence. But as the man came closer, Alex could sense that something wasn't right. The officer stopped just a few feet away and gave Alex a long look. Alex's heart rate remained steady, his expression unchanged. He had been in situations like this before, but every encounter was different. The officer didn't speak at first, just observed him as if trying to make sense of who Alex was. For a moment, Alex wondered if he should have acted differently, cross the street, take a different path, or maybe even make himself disappear into the crowd. But that's not how it worked. He couldn't let fear guide him, not now. "Hey," the officer finally said, his tone sharp and direct. "What are you doing here?" Alex took a deep breath, keeping his face neutral. He knew that the officer wasn't just asking a casual question. The man had already decided that Alex didn't belong here, that something was off about him. Alex didn't respond right away. He had to be careful. A simple answer could lead to more questions, and once that happened, he'd have to reveal too much. Alex wasn't about to expose his cover. The officer's eyes narrowed, as if waiting for Alex to say something, anything, that would give him a reason to act. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, Alex thought he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The city around them seemed to fade, and all he could focus on was the cop standing before him, blocking his path. "Are you lost or something?" the officer asked again, this time with a hint of irritation. "You look suspicious." Alex kept his composure, resisting the urge to explain himself. He wasn't lost, and he wasn't suspicious. But the officer clearly had made up his mind. Alex couldn't let this escalate. His eyes flicked to the side, noticing that the criminal group in the alley had started to move. The window for gathering information was closing, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. He needed to stay calm and handle the situation without giving away anything that would expose his real identity. "I'm just passing through," Alex said finally, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's gaze didn't soften. Instead, it grew more intense, more suspicious. He took a step closer to Alex, as if trying to intimidate him into revealing something. "I don't know about that," he muttered. "You're acting like you're hiding something." Alex stood tall, not backing away from the officer's scrutiny. He could feel the pressure mounting, but he knew better than to react impulsively. He had been trained for situations like this, trained to stay calm under pressure, to defuse tense moments before they escalated. But this officer didn't seem to be the type to back down easily. He had already made up his mind that Alex was guilty of something. "Listen, I've got to go," Alex said, trying to make his voice sound casual, like he was just a regular guy with a busy day ahead. He took a step to the side, hoping the officer would let him pass. But the cop didn't move. Instead, he stepped in front of Alex, blocking his way. "I'm not done with you," the officer snapped. "I need to see some ID." Alex's mind raced for a moment. He had to be careful. He couldn't just show his badge, not yet. If he did, he'd risk exposing the entire operation. But he also knew that if he didn't comply, things could get ugly. His training told him to stay calm, to think quickly, and to avoid a confrontation at all costs. This wasn't the time for a fight. "I don't have time for this," Alex said, his voice still calm but now carrying a hint of urgency. "I'm just trying to go about my day, all right? No harm done." The officer wasn't having it. He took a step forward, raising his voice now. "You don't get to walk away without showing ID. You're acting shady, and I'm not letting you off the hook that easily." Alex's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, and the last thing he needed was to draw attention. The officer's behavior was starting to feel like a direct challenge, but Alex knew that responding with aggression would only make the situation worse. He needed to handle this carefully, even though he could sense that the officer was not about to let him go without a confrontation. Alex stood there, trying to remain calm, but he could feel his patience slipping. The officer was making it clear that he wasn't going to let him go without a deeper explanation. Alex had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. The officer seemed to be determined, almost eager to prove a point. Alex glanced over his shoulder, quickly scanning the street for any sign of the criminals he had been watching. They hadn't moved much yet, but if this dragged on too long, he could miss his chance to gather the information he needed. "I said, show me your ID," the officer repeated, his voice firm, as if daring Alex to challenge him. His eyes were narrowed, and Alex could see the muscles in his neck tense. The man wasn't going to back down. Alex felt the pressure building. He knew this wasn't just about showing a simple ID anymore. The officer was testing him, trying to assert his authority. In the city, power struggles between cops and civilians weren't unusual, but Alex wasn't just any civilian. He was undercover, and he had to be careful. If he showed his real identity, everything would be exposed. His mission would be over. The criminals he was tracking could slip away, and all the work he and his team had put in would be wasted. For a brief moment, Alex thought about walking away. But that was a risk he couldn't take. The officer was blocking his path, and if he tried to leave now, it would only make things worse. Alex took a deep breath and shifted his weight, trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't afford to lose his cool. The last thing he needed was to get into an argument or escalate the situation into something bigger than it already was. "I'm just trying to get to work, man," Alex said, keeping his tone level. He was doing his best to sound casual, but it was becoming harder to keep his cool. "I don't have time for this. Can you just let me go?" The officer didn't budge. He took another step forward, his face now just inches from Alex's. Alex could feel the man's breath on his face, and he could see the arrogance in his eyes. It was clear the officer wasn't going to let this go without a fight. "You think you can just walk around here without anyone questioning you," the officer said, almost sneering. "You're acting like you've got something to hide." I'm not letting you go until you show me your ID. Alex felt a surge of frustration. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. But Alex couldn't let that frustration show. He had to remain calm. He had to think about the bigger picture. The criminals in the alley were still there, and Alex had a job to do. But right now, all his attention was focused on the cop in front of him. I told you, I'm not hiding anything, Alex said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm not doing anything wrong. Can you just let me go? The officer ignored him, still holding his ground. You're acting shady. I don't trust you. I've got a job to do too, and that means I get to check who's walking around here. Alex's mind raced. What could he do? He couldn't just give up his cover. If he did, he would risk everything. But if he didn't show the officer some form of identification, the situation could escalate further. He needed a way out, a way to defuse this without exposing himself. In the few moments of silence that followed, Alex tried to think fast. He had worked with law enforcement before, and he knew how some officers could be. Some were by the book, respectful of authority, while others acted like they were always in charge, always ready to prove a point. Unfortunately, Alex had drawn the attention of the second type today. The officer stared at him, his eyes challenging Alex, daring him to make the first move. Alex took another deep breath. He knew it wasn't the time for confrontation. Instead, he decided to play his cards carefully, just like he had been trained to do. I don't have my ID on me, Alex said, trying to sound apologetic but not desperate. But I'm really just a regular guy. I don't want any trouble. The officer didn't seem convinced. His eyes flicked over Alex, sizing him up as if trying to find something, anything, that would explain why he seemed so out of place. But Alex had spent years perfecting the art of blending in. He was good at it, but sometimes, that just made people more suspicious. Regular guy, huh? The officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You look like you're up to something. Maybe you just don't want to show me your ID because you're hiding something. Alex forced himself to keep his emotions in check. The officer was clearly trying to provoke him, trying to get him to react, to make a mistake. Alex knew that if he let his guard down, if he reacted even the slightest bit, the officer would see that as a win. I'm not hiding anything, Alex said, repeating his earlier words. I'm just trying to get on with my day. You can call whoever you need to verify who I am. I'm not trying to cause any problems. The officer didn't seem to buy it. His eyes were still narrow, his body tense. I don't need to call anyone. I've got you right here, and you're acting strange. That's enough for me to ask questions. Alex's mind raced again. What could he do? He had to stay calm, but every second was slipping away. The criminals in the alley were getting closer to finishing their deal. Alex needed to move, but he couldn't walk away without a solution. He could feel the officer's eyes drilling into him, waiting for a reaction. The city noise seemed to fade into the background as the two of them stood there, locked in this tense standoff. In that moment, Alex knew that he couldn't let his cover be blown, no matter what. He could feel his pulse quicken, but his breathing remained steady. He had to keep it together. He had to keep thinking. I'm not your problem, man, Alex said finally, his voice firm and calm. I'm just passing through. Can you please move? I've got places to be. But the officer didn't move. Instead, he stepped even closer, pushing his chest toward Alex's, trying to intimidate him. I'm not moving until you show me who you are. Alex's eyes narrowed, but he didn't take a step back. Instead, he stood his ground, silently daring the officer to make the next move. The tension was at a breaking point, and Alex knew it. He was walking a fine line, and every decision he made from here could change everything. The air between Alex and the officer hung thick with tension, and the seconds seemed to stretch on forever. Alex knew he couldn't keep this up for much longer. The officer was growing more impatient, and the longer they stood there, the more the situation could spiral out of control. He could feel the officer's gaze drilling into him, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint that he was lying. But Alex was an expert at maintaining his composure. His face remained calm, his body still. He had been trained for situations like this, and he wasn't about to give in to pressure. "I told you already, I'm not hiding anything," Alex said again, his voice steady but firm. He tried to keep it casual, as though this was just a misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just any misunderstanding. The officer's insistence was beginning to feel personal, as if he was looking for a reason to be right, to prove that Alex was guilty of something, even if there was no reason to believe that. The officer took another step closer, his breath now loud in the quiet street, and Alex could feel the heat radiating off his body. There was a moment when their eyes locked, and Alex saw something shift in the officer's expression. It was as if the officer was finally processing what Alex had said, but it didn't seem to change his demeanor. The officer's jaw tightened, and he stared at Alex with narrowed eyes, almost daring him to react. "You're hiding something," the officer muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Alex. "People don't act like this unless they're hiding something. You're either trying to get away with something or you're too scared to admit who you really are." Alex remained silent, but inside, his mind raced. He had already given the officer every chance to back down, to realize that this was a mistake, but the officer wasn't having it. There was no way to talk his way out of this now. Alex knew the officer wasn't just going to let him go unless something drastic happened. As if sensing the tension in the air, Alex's eyes flicked once again toward the alley where the criminals were. They hadn't moved much, but time was running out. Every second spent here was a second wasted, and he couldn't afford to lose track of his mission. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized just how much was at stake. But despite the mounting pressure, he remained still. He couldn't make a mistake now. Then, with a deep breath, Alex made a decision. He knew it was time to stop playing games. If the officer wasn't going to let him go peacefully, Alex had no choice but to reveal who he truly was, though in a way that wouldn't compromise his operation. He couldn't just hand over his badge. It wasn't just a matter of showing an ID, revealing himself as an undercover FBI agent could expose everything. He had to be subtle, strategic. Slowly, Alex reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, leather wallet. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, making sure the officer didn't see the flash of his badge just yet. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, watching every move. Alex didn't want to show the officer too much too soon. He wasn't just trying to prove a point, he needed to make sure the officer understood the gravity of the situation. He held the wallet in his hand, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked the officer square in the eye, silently communicating that this wasn't a fight he intended to win with force, but with clarity. The officer's expression was still tense, but there was a flicker of curiosity now, like he was waiting for the next move. Alex kept his gaze steady, his breathing calm. With a slight shift, Alex slowly opened the wallet and pulled out a government-issued ID, his FBI badge. He didn't hand it directly to the officer. Instead, he held it up for the officer to see, just enough so that it was visible but not enough to give away everything. It was subtle, a silent challenge to the officer's assumptions. The officer's face changed in an instant. His eyes widened, and his mouth went dry. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stared at the badge, his mind clearly processing what he was seeing. The confidence he had shown earlier, the determination to prove that Alex was hiding something, started to crumble. The officer's shoulders relaxed, and he stepped back, his posture shifting from aggressive to defensive. Alex could feel the shift in the air. The officer was no longer the one in control. The power had shifted, but Alex didn't gloat. He didn't make a big show of it. Instead, he kept his expression neutral, watching the officer carefully. The tension was still there, but now it was different. It wasn't the pressure of being caught in a lie, it was the weight of a mistake that had just been made. The officer looked from the badge to Alex's face, then back to the badge again. He blinked twice, clearly trying to process what was happening. The realization was dawning on him, and it was written all over his face. He was looking at an undercover FBI agent, someone who had been working in the shadows, gathering information, risking everything for the job. And here he was, standing on the street, caught in a moment of misunderstanding. The officer began, but his voice faltered. He didn't know what to say next. The words he had been preparing, accusations, demands, seemed hollow now. The truth was undeniable. The man in front of him wasn't just some random stranger, he was a highly trained professional, someone who had been operating under deep cover for a reason. The officer had been wrong, and the realization hit him hard. Alex didn't say anything right away. He simply watched the officer, waiting for him to gather his thoughts. This wasn't the time for a lecture or a show of superiority. The officer had made a mistake, and now he had to live with it. But Alex understood that everyone made mistakes. He wasn't here to make the officer feel worse, he just wanted to move on, finish his mission, and get back to the job at hand. The officer's face turned red, and he cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't realize, he muttered, his voice quieter now. The arrogance that had defined him just moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by a humbling sense of regret. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. Alex finally broke his silence, his tone calm and understanding. It's okay. It happens, he said, keeping his voice low. But you have to understand, I can't let my cover be blown. I'm here for a reason, and you can't be too quick to judge who's in your city. The officer nodded quickly, his face now a mix of embarrassment and humility. I get it. I do. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. Alex gave him a simple nod, signaling that the matter was over. Just remember, next time, not everyone you meet on the street is what they seem. Sometimes, you've got to take a step back and think before you act. With that, Alex turned away, moving back toward the alley where the criminals had been. He didn't look back. The officer stood still for a moment, watching him go, clearly shaken by the encounter. The tension had lifted, but for the officer, it would remain a lesson learned the hard way. As Alex walked away, he could feel the weight of the officer's eyes on his back. He didn't turn around, keeping his steps steady, his focus now entirely on the alley ahead where the criminals were still gathered. His mind was already shifting back to the task at hand. This was a minor setback, a small detour, but one that could have become a major problem if he hadn't handled it with care. The officer had clearly been shaken by the situation, but Alex didn't have time to dwell on that. The mission was what mattered now. Behind him, the officer stood motionless, his mind racing. The mistake he had made was impossible to ignore. He had gone from being the one in control to being the one caught off guard. The arrogance he had displayed moments ago had been replaced by a sinking feeling of regret. The officer's hands were now clenched at his sides as he stood there, not knowing what to do next. He felt humiliated, unsure how to salvage his own pride after confronting an undercover FBI agent without even realizing it. For a moment, the officer tried to tell himself that it wasn't his fault, that he had been doing his job, that he was just trying to ensure the safety of the streets. But deep down, he knew he had overstepped. The agent had been nothing but calm and composed, and yet, the officer had pushed him, questioning his every move. Now, the tables had turned, and the officer felt the weight of his own misjudgment. Alex's voice echoed in his mind, soft but powerful. Not everyone you meet on the street is what they seem. Sometimes, you've got to take a step back and think before you act. Those words resonated in the officer's mind, and he couldn't shake them. He had acted impulsively, too eager to prove himself, too quick to judge. The agent had given him no reason to believe he was a threat, but the officer had allowed his own biases and assumptions to cloud his judgment. He turned his gaze toward the alley, where Alex had walked. The officer could still see the agent's silhouette in the distance, blending back into the shadows as if nothing had happened. Alex wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, and he certainly wasn't the type to hold a grudge. But the officer knew that in this world, even the smallest misstep could lead to far-reaching consequences. What if Alex hadn't been so composed? What if things had escalated in a different direction? The officer couldn't help but wonder if he had just narrowly avoided a major disaster. The truth of the matter was simple: he had been out of his depth. He had misjudged someone who was far more skilled, far more experienced than he could have imagined. The officer had been a big fish in a small pond, always in control of his environment, always the one with the badge and the authority. But here, in this moment, he was nothing more than a man who had made a mistake. It wasn't something he was used to, and it stung more than he was willing to admit. As the officer stood there, the weight of his mistake settled heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the sweat on his brow, the tightness in his chest, and the heat in his face. It was one thing to make a mistake in private, but to be caught like this in front of another professional? That was a different kind of humiliation. He had been schooled, and the lesson wasn't something he could easily forget. The officer let out a deep sigh, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. He had wanted to show authority, to stand firm and prove that he was in control. But in the end, it wasn't his authority that mattered. It was his ability to read the situation, to understand when to push and when to pull back. And in this case, he had pushed too hard, too fast. Alex's calm demeanor had only made the officer's actions seem more foolish in comparison. The agent hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any accusations, hadn't tried to confront the officer. He had simply remained composed, revealing the truth only when the officer's persistence left him no other choice. And in that moment, the officer realized that there was more to power than just having a badge. There was wisdom, there was restraint, and there was the ability to know when to step back and listen. As the officer stood there, a thought crossed his mind: what if Alex had not shown his ID? What if the situation had escalated? What if they had gotten into a physical confrontation? What if Alex had been forced to reveal his true identity in a more public way? The officer's stomach churned at the thought of how badly things could have gone wrong. In that instant, the officer made a silent promise to himself. He would never let his ego get in the way again. He would never let assumptions cloud his judgment, and he would always remember that sometimes, true strength lies not in authority, but in understanding. He had learned that the hard way today. Back in the alley, Alex was still focused on the job at hand. He had made the decision to keep moving, to leave the officer behind. He knew that the encounter could have gone differently, that it could have easily escalated into something much worse. But he had managed to stay calm, to maintain control of the situation, and to defuse it before things got out of hand. As Alex approached the group of criminals again, he could feel the weight of the encounter fading into the background. His focus was sharp once more, his mind racing with the information he had gathered so far. The officer was no longer his concern. The mission was. Alex knew that sometimes, the smallest encounters could have the biggest consequences. He had learned that from years of experience. But the officer, in his own quiet way, had learned something too. He had learned the hard way that not everything was as it seemed. He had learned that authority could be an illusion, and that the true test of character came when no one was watching. As Alex disappeared back into the shadows, The officer stood there for a few more moments, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. He would never forget this day, the day he had been schooled, and the lesson he had learned from it. As Alex disappeared into the shadows of the alley, the officer stood there, rooted to the spot, his thoughts still swirling. The noise of the city continued around him, but it all felt distant now, as though he were hearing it from far away. His eyes followed Alex's retreating figure, the man who had just taught him a hard but necessary lesson. The officer took a deep breath and slowly let it out, his shoulders sagging with a weight that he couldn't quite shake. He was still trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. How had he gone from being the one in charge to the one who had made the mistake? He glanced down at his hands, the same hands that had been so quick to demand answers, so quick to push Alex, a man he hadn't known, to the brink. His grip on his pride and confidence had slipped, and he had been exposed for what he truly was, a man who was too quick to judge and too eager to prove himself. He was supposed to be in control, but instead, he had been schooled by someone he had dismissed as just another ordinary man. The officer felt a pang of embarrassment, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of regret. The moment had passed, and Alex was long gone, but the lesson he had imparted was not something that would fade so easily. The officer knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also knew he had a choice. He could wallow in his mistake, blaming the circumstances or his own pride, or he could take responsibility and learn from it. Turning away from the alley, the officer made his way back to his patrol car, his step slow and thoughtful. He had been in this job for years, and in all that time, he had seen a lot of things. But today, he had learned something that no training or street experience had ever taught him. He had learned that real authority wasn't about how loud you could be or how quickly you could demand answers. It was about knowing when to step back, when to listen, and when to show restraint. It was about understanding that not every person you encountered needed to be treated like a suspect. Sometimes, the biggest mistake you could make was assuming you knew everything about someone based on nothing more than your own biases. As he sat in the driver's seat of his car, the officer pulled the rearview mirror toward him, staring at his reflection for a long moment. His eyes were tired, his face etched with the signs of a long day. But now, his mind was clearer than it had been in a long time. He thought back to Alex, the way the agent had remained calm, the way he had handled the situation with grace and patience, never losing his composure. The officer couldn't help but admire that. It was something he wished he could do more often, something he needed to work on. He reached for the radio and turned it on, but before he could say anything, he paused, considering what had just happened. This wasn't just another day in the life of a cop. This was a moment that would stay with him. It would change how he saw things, how he interacted with people, how he carried himself. He couldn't let it go to waste. The officer started the engine and pulled out of the parking spot, merging into the flow of traffic. His thoughts were still on Alex, still on the way the agent had turned a potential confrontation into a teaching moment. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much Alex had taught him, without ever saying a word. It wasn't about the badge or the uniform, it was about the way you carried yourself, the way you handled the moments that really mattered. And today, Alex had shown him exactly how to do that. Back in the alley, the criminals had gone their separate ways, and Alex was already out of sight, continuing his mission. But for the officer, the day was far from over. He knew that he had to be better, not just for himself, but for the people he served. If he was going to continue being part of the city's police force, he had to be more than just someone who wore a badge. He had to be someone who could handle the job with the respect it deserved, someone who knew how to read a situation and respond with wisdom, not ego. Alex's quiet words echoed in his mind, "Not everyone you meet on the street is what they seem." It was such a simple statement, yet it carried so much weight. It wasn't just about people hiding their identities or their true intentions, it was about the way we all see the world through our own lens, and how that lens can sometimes distort the truth. The officer had seen Alex as just another person to interrogate, just another potential troublemaker. But Alex had proven that assumption wrong in an instant. The officer had judged him too quickly, and in doing so, had nearly jeopardized everything. As the officer drove, he started to think about his interactions with others. How many times had he made snap judgments, assuming things about people based on their appearance, their behavior, or their situation? How many times had he let his own sense of authority blind him to the reality of a situation? It was easy to get caught up in the power dynamic, to forget that everyone had a story, everyone had a reason for being where they were. But the truth was that no one could truly understand someone else's story without first taking the time to listen, without taking the time to see them as more than just an assumption or a stereotype. The officer made a mental note to himself: he would do better. He would be more patient, more thoughtful, and more understanding. He would remember that authority was not something that needed to be forced, it was something that needed to be earned, day by day, interaction by interaction. Back at the police station, the officer sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him but not really seeing it. His mind was still on the day's events, still processing the lesson he had learned. He knew that the people he interacted with on a daily basis deserved his respect, whether they were law-abiding citizens or not. And he knew that if he didn't learn to check his assumptions, he would only continue to make the same mistakes. Alex's lesson had not just been about patience, it had been about humility. It had been about the realization that sometimes, the most important thing you could do in a situation was step back and let go of your own ego. And as the officer sat there, he realized that this was something he needed to work on. This was the real test of character. He had failed today, but it wouldn't be the last time. He would learn, he would improve, and he would make sure that next time, he would be ready for whatever came his way. For Alex, the day had been just another part of his ongoing mission, another small piece of the puzzle. He had learned long ago that every day brought its own set of challenges, its own set of lessons. But as he continued with his work, he knew that today had taught the officer something important. And maybe, just maybe, that lesson would stick with him, long after the encounter was over.